Hello, I am Jennifer Lynn Barnes, the author of The Inheritance Games, which is the Barnes & Noble YA book club pick for September, which means both that I am here today talking to you and that the Barnes & Noble version of the book has an exclusive second epilogue that you cannot get anywhere else. And I'm here today chatting with the fabulous E. Lockhart, who is the author of some of my favorite books. Including We Were Liars and the Disreputable History of Frankie Landau Banks, and Again. And I am so excited to be here with Emily and talking to you all.
I'm so excited to be here with you, Jen. Thank you guys for joining us. So what's happening tonight is that we are celebrating the launch of Inheritance Games. I'm going to hold it up again. It's so good. And it's juicy mystery storyline and really more cute boys than I thought anybody could pack into a single novel, which is the B&N Book Club pick and debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. So congratulations, Jen.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then there's going to be a Q&A. So you should definitely stick around and ask us your questions and get them ready. And you'll be able to put them in the chat or the comments below on Facebook or on YouTube, and the powers that be at Barnes & Noble will get them.
Get those to us.
Okay, so Jennifer Lynn Barnes is the best-selling author, if you don't know this already, of Little White Lies and its sequel, Deadly Little.
Deadly.
No, it's not dirty. Deadly Little Scandals, the Natural series, which is like amazing, the serial killer chasing the amazing, terrifying squad thing that happens. The Lovely and the Lost. And most recently, The Inheritance Games. Also, one of my favorite YA series from a long time ago called The Squad, which is basically about superhero, well, what are they? They're spies, cheerleaders who are also spies, which is the Squad.
The many years ago.
Oh my God, it's so good. All right, so she is very, very page-turny and very exciting, often with lots of action and mystery. She's also a professor of psychology and writing at the University of Oklahoma, and you can find her on Twitter at Jen Lynn Barnes. All right, so I really loved Inheritance Games. And why don't you just, I said cute boys and mystery. Maybe you want to describe it a little more for the people who haven't.
Yes, so my description of the book is always, it is about an eccentric billionaire who dies and leaves his entire fortune to a teenage girl who's essentially a total stranger. And she has no idea why, but to inherit, she has to move into his sprawling, secret passage-filled mansion and live there for a year alongside the family he just disinherited, which includes his 4 very attractive grandsons. And it's a mystery, but I'd come off of writing murder mysteries, and this mystery is a different kind of mystery because the question at the center of it is, for Avery, why me? Which I love, because I love that we've all asked that question about ourselves at one point in time, usually not why did someone leave me $42 billion, but that why me question, I find it was a really fun thing to write. Instead of writing who killed these dead bodies, like why did this amazing, incredible thing happen to this girl?
And this book came right or shortly after Little White Lies and Deadly Little Scandals, which is a pair of novels set in Southern high society about debutante culture and also cute boys and mystery and yeah, all that. And I was interested to know a little bit about how you come to writing about that kind of Southern elite. And like if there's any link to your own family or just where your fascination comes from,
Yes. So the Inheritance Games is set in Texas. I grew up in Oklahoma. The high school she goes to in Inheritance Games is loosely based on my own high school. To get the names of the courses she takes during there, I looked up what courses my high school is currently offering, and some of our sister high schools in Texas were currently offering. So I really had this strong context. And I had always written things that were very different from my life. Like, I, in fact, do not hunt serial killers for a living. I was a cheerleader, never been a secret agent. I used to write paranormal. And then with Little White Lies and Deadly Little Scandals, I actually pulled from my own life. So when I was a senior in high school, my mom said, I want you to do something for me. And she's the best mom in the entire world. So I was like, oh crap, whatever it is, I'm going to have to do it. She's just amazing. And she's like, I want you to do a debutante year. I was like, oh, somewhat reluctant, but I agreed and I did it. And then writing that was really interesting because I've always had to really actively create worlds and just make stuff up. And that was my first time being like, wait a second, when you're not making stuff up, when you have something to toggle it onto, it makes the parts that you do have to make up or embellish easier. So I wanted to stay somewhat in that world with the Inheritance Games. And Little White Lies, she doesn't go to high school, so I hadn't used anything about the sort of private school world that I was in down there. But I also was really obsessed with the idea. So the first thing I had for the Inheritance Games was actually Hawthorn House, which is this amazing, incredible house that she lives in. And I have never been to an actual Hawthorn house, but when I was a senior in college, my dad retired and he spent 5 years after that designing and building their dream house, which again is nothing like Hawthorn House, except that they asked me, do you have any requests? So they were taking requests for the house. And I said, can I have a secret passage? And can it be a bookshelf that disappears into a wall? And they built it for me. He's got this amazing library in their house. And there is, you can trigger a secret passage and this giant bookshelf disappears into a wall. But the thing that really struck me about it is when you walk through this house, my dad, he didn't have a background in architecture or design or anything, but he worked with them on everything about the house, like every molding, every cabinet, every faucet, like he helped pick out, and he would go to the construction site every day when they were building the house. So once it was built, I remember walking in and just thinking, there is so much of my dad in this place. Like, you can't even be in this house without feeling him. And the combination of that, the person behind the house being in the house and the secret passage, I immediately started thinking, well, what's this? But like times a million. And that's when I first got the idea for what eventually became Hawthorn House. And I was like, okay, it's way, 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 way bigger. It's way more elaborate. It doesn't just have one secret passage, it has hundreds. And I'm like, well, who's the person who would build that house? And I had this idea for years where I wanted to write what I called my puzzle house book, where there were puzzles and codes and things in the walls of the house. And I kept pitching it to my publisher and different ideas, and they kept saying no. And then finally I got the idea for Avery, someone leaving, a billionaire leaving the fortune to a total stranger. And I was like, and then she has to move into his puzzle house. And then they finally said yes, but that was really the tie for this one. So my parents' house is nothing like Hawthorn House, except for that one bookshelf that disappears into a wall.
I love that you started with the place, though, like the place and just that feeling of the puzzles built into the house. I have started a couple of different books with a place and just been hunting around for, like, We Were Liars just started with, that's an island. It's going to be an island and that's owned by this one family, and some stuff will happen on the island.
I love private islands, by the way. I think I owe you for the private island. There's a mention of one in the first Inheritance book, Hawthorn Island. And I was like, thank you, Emily.
Yeah, well, all kinds of stuff can happen when you're isolated on an island and there's no one else there, right? Very good for fiction. But yeah, I carried around the island for a long time. And I remember meeting with editors and being like, well, there's some people, some of them are probably teenagers and they're on an island. They'd be like, yeah. And
you're like, and what happened there? And then finally it comes together.
Yeah, it took a very long time. So you already described the house for people, which I think is actually a huge, it's unusual for a novel to have such a selling point being being the architecture that's described, but it is it's like you want to visit this house. It's so amazing. Did you have a favorite part of the house that you created?
So I can't remember if I gave the house 5 libraries or 6 libraries, but I gave the house a ton of libraries. And one thing I have to do when I'm trying to describe things, I don't actually get visual images in my head. I'm one of those people who you say picture an apple and I just kind of think apple and I don't really see anything. So if I want to visually describe something for a book, I often just have to pull up a lot of images that I can look at. So I spent an embarrassingly long amount of time doing image searches for like the world's most amazing home libraries. And Hawthorn House ended up with 5 or 6 of them because I couldn't decide which one was my favorite. And so I'd be like, well, I want this home library and this home library and this one, and put them all in there. And then I am also a secret passage girl, as you might notice when my parents were like, what do you want in your room? Secret passage. Like, I don't care about anything else. Just give me a bookshelf, disappears into a wall, a candlestick, you can pull something. So those are my 2 favorite things, all the libraries, and then actually knowing that you can just disappear in the walls, and the idea that you can get lost in them, and the idea that even the Hawthorne brothers who've lived there their entire lives might not know or have discovered all of the secret passages yet. Because I love the idea, and I love the idea that the house was never finished, that he was always adding on rooms and adding on more mysteries and all of that.
I'm glad you brought up the brothers, because one thing I really liked is, these people are super wealthy and privileged, but brothers are brothers, siblings are siblings. People fight and feel jealous and form alliances in a family group, no matter where they come from. And there's always going to be some pain, and there's always going to be some joy in those relationships. And I felt like you really captured that. And that's true for Avery and her sister, as well as for, Avery and her sister are, one family unit, and then these brothers are kind of another family unit. And there's some parallels there that I thought were really interesting. But I also think that, there's sort of the beefcake element going on, right? They're all beautiful and dashing. There's Grayson and Jameson and Nash and Xander, and they're all very close in age. Every single one is a potential romantic interest at one moment or another. Maybe not Nash, but for Avery at least. But I wondered if you had a favorite, or if any of them are, how did you build them? How did you build these brothers? And do you have a favorite?
So when I'm building characters, I usually start with the archetype. So like, this is the type of characters I wanted. So I knew I wanted 4 brothers, and I was like, 3 brothers doesn't seem like quite enough. I need 4 amazingly charismatic, mysterious, attractive brothers. 5 seemed like I would be getting to a little too many. And so then I start saying, okay, well, you've got the oldest brother, and he's going to be defined, at least in part, by the fact that like he's the one who's 5 or 6 years older than all the others. So he was around for a while, and then he has the 3 little brothers. And I'm a sucker for older brother characters in fiction, like the somewhat protective older brother. And so I was trying out different archetypes for that for Nash, and I loved the idea. I'd never written someone who's a little more like, he takes things a little slow, he's a little casual, he's got the cowboy hat he's already in. And so as soon as I kind of knew Nash, cowboy hat, and that he'd never wanted the money and was kind of the nomad, I was like, okay, that's the type he is. And then I got to the 3 younger boys who are all born like about a year apart. So Grayson in my mind was always going to be the like the guy who always wears a suit and is kind of obsessed with honor and family. One of my touchstones, I often have touchstone characters. So he's a little bit inspired by Elijah Michelson from Vampire Diaries, who also always wears a suit and is like very protective of his siblings. Jameson, I knew, since this was going to be about playing games, that I wanted one brother to be defined by playing games. And I'm like, well, that's obviously kind of your roguish, doesn't take anything serious type. And then with the youngest brother, Xander, you often see a phenomenon with siblings called niche filling, which is that as you go further and further down the birth order, it's essentially like what niche is still available to you. So you define yourself in part by what the older siblings kind of already are. So Grayson and Jameson were very competitive with each other. I wanted Xander to be probably the smartest of all of them. He's my favorite to write of all of them. So if I have a favorite Hawthorne, it's Xander. I wanted him to be the one who had the brain closest to the old man's. So he sees things in almost 4 dimensions. He builds those Rube Goldberg machines. He's the one who can do all of this. But I also wanted at least one who didn't seem in any way kind of threatening to Avery. So I wanted my character who just kind of love. And he was the youngest brother. I'm like, okay, he's kind of the playful one because he's the youngest, really loves baked goods. So I had the general idea for them. And what I do once I know kind of the role I want them to fill is I'm a developmental psychologist by training. So then I go back to childhood. And then I'm like, basically, if this person were a real person growing up in Hawthorn House, at this place in the birth order with these other brothers, how would they have come to fulfill this trope? And I think that's what takes it from writing just the 2-dimensional trope version that I know when I start to actually fleshing that character out to 3 dimensions. So I want to know, like, what are the key things about their childhood that made them become that person? What are the key events that happened before the book started that made Grayson so obsessed with family, or that made Jameson treat everything like it's a game? And then I do this weird thing where I toggle back and forth from the future or from the present to the past. And this will tell me, well, if this was the case in their childhood, then he would also be like this. And then I'll be like, but if he's also like this, then that. And I just go back and forth until they start to feel real to me.
That is fascinating. That is not how I know how to write at all. This is very cool. I really like that. I wanted to ask you about the puzzles, because I've written books with like puzzles or pranks, and my mind doesn't actually naturally do that stuff. Like I'm a terrible Scrabble player, even though I love words. And you would think I would love word games, but I'm unable to, like rearrange things doesn't happen. So people often think, oh, you must have like played a lot of pranks in your college years or something, because there were so many pranks in Disreputable History of Frankie Landau Banks. But I had to scour the internet. I bought books on college pranks. I read about all the histories of the most famous pranks that ever were. And then there were sections of the novel that it said, prank goes here for the longest time. And then eventually I would figure out a prank, and then I would sort of retrofit the rest of the book. So I wondered if did you know the puzzles ahead of time? Did you have to leave blanks? Or does your brain actually just work that way? How did you do them?
So there were kind of 2 parts to the puzzle sequence. One was the mystery part, like knowing the answer to the big question. Why did he choose Avery? And the other mysteries of the book, like what happened to tear Jameson and Grayson apart. So I knew those first thing. Like I tried out, I auditioned several ultimate answers, and then I got one of them, and I knew basically what they were going to find at the end when they found something very early on. And then once I sat down to write the book, I took one day and wrote the entire puzzle sequence, where I just said, okay, this is going to be the first puzzle, and it leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this. And that never really changed very much across all the drafts of the book.
Yeah,
so I
spread out through the novel.
Yes.
Right. So I figured it all out in one go.
I figured it all out in one go. And then this was like the easiest A plot, like the primary plot I'd ever written, because I knew what the puzzles were and I knew what the solutions were. So anytime I got to a part in the book when they had to solve a puzzle, it was like the easiest writing day and the most fun, because I already knew what the puzzles were. So it's actually much harder for me to do like the character arcs and the relationships and all of the dynamics between everyone. And this book had a very large cast, so making sure everyone's coming in and out but you still know who everyone is. And she's got arcs with all of the different people. So that's really where I have to spend a lot of my time beating my head against the wall until it's in a place where I really like it, is more characterization and relationships. Whereas the puzzle sequence in this, the serial killer sequences and the naturals, those are all super easy for me. So I'm in, get that done right away. And then what I discover as I write is I'm discovering really the people and how they interact with each other and how those relational arcs are going to play out.
Wow. You have an interesting brain. I'm impressed. We only have a couple more minutes before we're going to take questions from our audience. So you guys, if you have questions, put them in the comments below, and Barnes & Noble will get them to Jen, and we're excited to see what you have to ask. But I'm going to ask her a couple super quick other questions. I watched your TED talk. You have a TEDx talk about fictional relationships, like the relationships that we have with fictional characters. I would encourage all of you to just Google Jen Lynn Barnes and TEDx talk, because it was really, really interesting, especially in this pandemic when we can't see our friends. And it was really struck home to me, thinking about how meaningful fictional characters can be and how much solace we can get from these imaginary people, and reminded me how important fiction has been in my own life, in shaping my character and my relationships with live people. So I really appreciated that. And I guess I don't really know that I have a question about it so much.
I have been.
Yeah, if you want to talk a little more about that,
sure.
I'd love to hear it.
I've been thinking about it so much for the past 6 months. So what a lot of the research says is that our imaginary relationships with fictional characters have many of the psychological benefits of relationships with real people. So it's like your brain doesn't quite know that it's not a real one. So you can still feel love and support and closeness and intimacy, even though these parasocial relationships are one-sided. And one of the things that's been hardest for me the past 6 months is I've noticed, and I have talked to our other friend, Allie Carter, about this, that it's been very difficult for me to form new parasocial relationships since March. And I think it's because—
you define parasocial really quickly.
Parasocial relationship is a one-sided relationship you form with either a fictional character or a celebrity by consuming media about that person. So when you start to feel like a character is actually your friend, that's a parasocial relationship. And so I always read a ton, and I've had such a hard time reading, and even such a hard time watching new television shows. Since lockdown happened. I was talking to Allie Carter about it, and she said, I think I'm too burnt out for new fictional friends. And I was like, I'm a scientist. So I said, theorizing, I think that's exactly what's going on. But of course, that wasn't suitable for me, because I need to be able to do this because we're not seeing all of our real friends all the time. So it's even more important to have those fictional friends. So I figured out 2 ways that I think, at least for me, help short circuit it. One is that the research that says that we get a sense of belonging from fiction says we get it from favorite characters who you have this bond with, but we also get it from fictional groups, particularly something like a family or a team that feels like a family, or a society, a really tight-knit fictional group. It doesn't actually have to be on the level of we're already a close friend to give you that sense of belonging. So I think that's why I love writing about families. You talked about how the inheritance games is a sibling story, right? And basically all of my books are about someone who starts the book not having a place to belong and not really having their people yet, because that was my experience as a teenager, where that I hadn't found that place and people with whom I really felt like I absolutely belonged and could just be myself. So I always like to write characters who start from the outside and then become part of a team or a family unit or something. And even though the setup of inheritance games, you would think that the Hawthorns are kind of the antagonists of the book, and in some ways they are, they're also it's this really tight, incredible bond they have, that she is the one person in the world who is somehow getting to be on the inside of this bond. So my way of getting around the hardness of new parasocial relationships is to look for fiction that's focused on a family or a team that's like a family, or something that has that, you know, cousins, just something that's really this tight knit bond where they have a lot of history. And for me, that's helped me get back into it and get around it. The other trick is to reread or go back to a series that you started but didn't finish, because those actually aren't new friends. Those are old friends who you just haven't seen in a while.
Yeah. Oh, so that leads me to another question about, read-alikes that you might recommend in terms of family or in terms of mystery thrillers. The thing that I kept coming up as I was reading Inheritance Games in a funny way was Crazy Rich Asians. Have you read that by Kevin Kwan?
I have.
Yeah, I mean, it's a totally, it does not have the same kind of thriller plot. There's so many differences. The obvious similarity to me was, this entry into a super, super exaggeratedly wealthy culture. But when I thought about and that was fun in Crazy Rich Asians and in the Inheritance Games. But when I was thinking about what actually I got was getting into the family, right? That both of them is a big eccentric family, and getting to be like in the middle and understanding all of that history that goes way back and is going on now to create all this drama, and that feeling of like being surrounded by the big family. That's the same. It's the same pleasure to me.
Yes. So I think you're right on the track about some of the underlying pleasures here. It's funny because I also do psychological work on what are we hardwired to find pleasurable, and wealth and safe danger and competition. There's a reason this is called the Inheritance Games. It's the wealth competition, and those are things we're hardwired to care about. But yes, I think at the core, it's any of those books where you've got someone coming and then they find their place and they become part of that team. I think probably one of the closest read-alikes is Maureen Johnson's Truly Deviously series, and that there's both a mystery, an overarching mystery. There's an eccentric rich old man who has left a legacy behind. And there is that motley group of kids coming together where they've never fit anywhere else, and they fit very closely there. And strangely enough, a lot of the books that to me hit the same buttons end up being high fantasy, because I think it's like you're like at the palace, and it's almost like the palace intrigue. So like I loved Incendiary by Zoraida Cordova. But it is all those tropes, right? Because you've got the sudden, she's the sudden princess. People call it a Cinderella story. And you're like, yes, because it has that kind of fantasy-like element. And a lot of what I like to try and do is because I love high fantasy, I love paranormal, and I often try and say, as a psychologist, what are the pleasures this is giving me? I love court intrigue, and I love the girl who becomes the princess, and I love the reluctant princes, and all of those tropes, and then say, what's the realistic version of that? Yes. So
I know Zoraida, but what's the title of that book that you just recommended?
Incendiary. It's got a lot of palace intrigue. It's got a team that was kind of tight knit, and then she goes in and she has to be kind of undercover in the palace and pretending she's not with the people she's with, and the figuring out of the who can you trust and all of that was actually court intrigue books in general, where you're basically the spy in the court of the king, is actually kind of an inspiration for what I wanted to capture in the Inheritance Games, just without the magic.
Right. Love it. Okay, so those are two great read-alikes, Incendiary and Truly Devious. And we're ready for questions if people have them. Alex from Barnes & Noble, do you want to send us in some questions from people on YouTube and Facebook? Okay. Lindsay asked, do you have a favorite brother? You did talk about Xander, but maybe you want to talk a little bit more about what you love about him.
Yes. So my favorite brother to write and my favorite brother if I were a reader might be two different people. So Xander is by far my favorite brother to write, because often I've just come off a scene and it feels like everyone's all gloom and doom and things are happening, and Avery can get very caught up in her own head and she's second guessing everything, and all of that stuff is so hard. And then Xander comes into a scene and he's just 100% Xander all the time, and he's fun to write and he makes me smile and he brings out a different dimension of Avery. And Avery never gets so caught up in her own thoughts and the puzzles and all of that stuff when she's with Xander, because Xander just has this way of making people live in the moment so much. So he is definitely my favorite one to write, and sort of knowing, like, I know a lot of stuff that Xander knows that everyone else doesn't know while I'm writing, and I love doing that. But I suspect if I were reading the book, I would still love Xander. But I'd be much more drawn to the other three. And it's hard for me to pick a favorite because I designed them all to be maximally appealing to me in different ways. So, I love Nash as the overprotective big brother. I let Grayson play overprotective big brother too. I love the Jameson scenes I get to write where he is sort of taking risks, because Avery isn't really a risk taker necessarily that much by nature, because she's always had to have backup plans for her backup plans, right? So she can take calculated risks and that's in there, but life has made her a little more cautious. So I love writing the scenes where he is, going 200 miles an hour, or he's always up on tall stuff and she's always afraid he's going to fall. And so I love all of those different elements of them. And that's one of the funnest things about the book, is just getting to jump from brother to brother and getting all of those characters in there and watching how I say watching, even though I'm the one writing it, but experiencing her interactions with all of them.
Mm-hmm. And Grayson asked who, if any of the brothers, was the hardest to write.
Who is the hardest to write? I think Grayson was the one I had to work the most on in revision, because I always knew who Grayson was, but making that come across on the page when he is the brother who holds the most in, and you're writing first person. So he is the one who is going to protect his inner vulnerabilities, and he is the one who is not going to necessarily tell you what he's thinking and feeling. He is the one who is in the most antagonistic role to her. Yet I knew all of this stuff about why, and I knew the vibe I wanted him to have, and I knew I wanted readers to, despite the fact that he's kind of acting, like a pompous jerk to her part of the time, I wanted them to see that other part of him too. And that was very hard to do when I couldn't just show you a Grayson scene and show you what was going on in his head. So he's probably the hardest to write, which just means his scenes get the most passes. Where I just have to, with a Grayson scene, I just have to do it over and over and over again until it's one of the only times when it actually comes down to the exact wording of the characters, where like his actual tone of voice and the way he's standing and what he's doing and all those sort of nonverbal cues have to carry a lot more weight. Because with a character like Xander or even Jameson, they're both talkers. And Avery's not necessarily a talker and Grayson's not a talker. So writing two non-talkers together and actually making them talk is a lot more challenging.
Yeah. The reserved characters, I think, can be much harder to write for me as well. Are you doing a sequel? It seems like you might be.
Yes, the sequel has been completed. It is off to copy edits.
Oh my God, tell us all the secrets.
I can tell you get a lot of answers. So I'm not saying I'm not going to throw more puzzles at you, but by the end of the book, you will know the answers to questions you might have currently. So that is probably just about all I can say without spoilers. There's more puzzle sequences. There is another mystery from the past, much like the Emily mystery in the first book. You can probably, if you've read the whole book, you probably have some guesses about what that mystery from the past is. And if you read the special second epilogue in the Barnes and Noble version, that's one of the only times on page you actually get to see, I always call him the old man because that's how the boys refer to him, Tobias Hawthorne on the page. So that second epilogue has a flashback. You actually get to see Tobias Hawthorne. You get to see how he thinks. And that, I actually wrote that simultaneous with writing the second book. And that actually helped me a lot delve into kind of, this is a person who, I think they say in the epilogue, he never kills why kill two birds with one stone when you can kill 12. So there's always more layers to what is going on and more elaborations to this plan, because much like Xander, this is someone who is not just playing three-dimensional chess, let's throw time in there as a fourth dimension, and he's got sort of this very, very complicated long view of things that was very fun to play with, and that I am very excited for readers to get to read next September.
Do you have the title?
I do, but it's secret, and I suspect they might want to do some kind of puzzle to release it.
All right, so we have a few more questions, so we may have to go through them quickly to get to them. Wendy, I'm scrolling up. Was it Wendy? Yes, Wendy asked, is it being made into a movie?
It is in development as a television show at Amazon with Sony and a producer named Josh Berman. We've got a writer named Grania Godfrey on board. We just announced the other day she's coming off of a lot of the DC shows on the CW, like Legends of Tomorrow, and she's going to be writing our pilot script. So it is in development, but not just as a movie, looking a lot more long form than that.
That sounds great. Congratulations. Shannon said, I can't wait to find out what the secret Avery's mom had about the day she was born. Will you be answering that in the next book? And can you give us any hints?
Yes and no. So yes, you will get your answer. No, I cannot give you any hints. But the big questions I leave you with in book one are all answered in book two.
Okay. And Lahal Nance asked, will you write a follow-up in the Little White Lies series, a third book?
That is unlikely. I actually wrote book two that was meant to be a duology. I always know, I think in series, so I always know if I wrote another book, what would it be? But in that case, if I ever did write another book, it would be with a new generation of debutantes. It would be with like their younger siblings age group, because I really feel like I did with the characters we were in, get to tell that whole story over a duology.
Okay. So same world, different people.
Yes. And even that is unlikely. I'm not saying never, but I tend to fall very deeply in love with whatever I'm working on currently. And currently that is this series.
Right. And I feel like I'm up for this one going on for, 6 books or more. Okay. Crystal had a writing question, which is, how do you know when not to take your editor's suggestions? This is a very smart question. I struggle with this too.
So I love revision. And one of the things I realized, and it took me several books to sort of reframe how I viewed revising, from fixing what's wrong to taking your book to the next level. And there's always a next level. And when you view an editor's suggestions through that lens, I don't really view them as, she might suggest doing one thing and I might think, no, that's not right for the book. But then I ask, what's the problem that she's identified? And then I find a solution to that. And what solution to that problem can take that book from right here to being way up here? And I want to always be writing it like, what's the best book at my current ability level that I can write? I always want to be pushing it to the best thing I can do. Like, maybe I can't do better than that right now because I'm always learning and always getting better. But so I really do a lot of re-envisioning based on a revision letter. I'm very organized about it. I color code them. So I go through and I highlight and then I put things on index cards. But almost always when I don't take my editor's suggestion, it's because the editor has sort of said, well, here's one thing you could try that could solve this problem. And my response is, but what if I tried this much more difficult thing that's going to take me 10 times as much time as what you suggested, but is going to completely change the book in a big way. So I don't ever feel pressured to use the solution that my editor has identified. But I trust all of my editors that when they identify the problem is there. And my job as an author is to sort of get all of the problems in my head at once and try and kill 12 birds with one stone and come to the vision of the book that will do everything we all want it to do. And that might not be present in the edit letter, but without my editor's suggestions, I would never get there myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so smart. All my editors say, well, could you make her more likable at the beginning? Whoever the main character is, any book, can you make her more likable at the beginning? And usually, no. What am I going to have her save a kitten or something? I mean, so usually I think, oh, the problem is not she's not likable. It's you're a little bored.
Yes.
Right?
So make her more interesting, make the situation more interesting.
Get the stakes higher, get it moving faster. If it's moving faster, you will end up liking her because she'll be in big trouble and you will need to see how she's going to get out of it. Right? Or it won't matter whether you like her. She'll be already in and you'll dislike her, but you'll still be involved in the story.
Have to know how her mind works and what she's going on and what's going to happen.
Right. So I interpret that piece of feedback as boredom rather than as me trying to like make her be more charming or more relatable or right. Okay. We're almost done, and I'm going to ask you a couple more questions that are on the thing. But before I do that, I want to remind you guys you can buy this book. And if you have read it already and you are just like, well, I need to read something else by Jen immediately, I think you should go and read, I think you should read Little White Lies next. That is going to give you like the most inheritance games bang for your buck, but The Naturals really would not be a bad choice at all. And there's four books in that series.
Yes.
Yes, and they're all available at Barnes & Noble, and there's a link below for Inheritance Games if you haven't read it yet. You could also read my book, Again. You could also read Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson or Incendiary by Zoraida Cordova, which Jen recommended as Rita likes. So you should buy books because, I don't know, you need your imaginary friends, as she has told you, to stay sane during the pandemic. We have a couple more questions and then we're going to say goodbye. There we go. Grayson asked about the characters of Grayson and Jameson and their grief and techniques that you use to depict the grief and how you wanted it to come across. So that deeper part of the novel. Right.
So I wanted to know essentially what each brother's defense mechanism was. Like, what's their coping mechanism for coping with grief? And it always really helps me before I can show it in a really textured and nuanced way on the page and explore it. I have to have, they talk about a project having a log line, which is that one sentence that describes the premise of the book. I write log lines for characters where I'll have one sentence that describes the character. I wanted essentially a log line. What is the short, to the point description that describes how these two people responded to this same traumatic loss? And so I knew from the beginning that sort of my log line for Jameson's grief was that after they lost Emily, he treated life as a game, because if everything's a game, nothing hurts you. So I knew he was going to be taking more risks, taking things less seriously, wanting to play more, right? And so that's his coping mechanism, is it can't hurt you if you don't let it, essentially, and nothing hurts if it's all just a game. So that's in large part what drives him, I think, that he is the one who wants to play their grandfather's game. Why is that? Because Jameson has been playing games and doing nothing but playing games nonstop for a year by the time this starts, because as long as it's a game, it doesn't hurt. And so that was his log line: as long as it's a game, it doesn't hurt. And of course, as an author, you're going to be like, guess what? I'm going to make it hurt at some point. And that's, how you can move them through the grief. And I knew for Grayson, this was one of the ones that I sort of that I went back and forth between the present and the past in, because I knew I wanted him to be very protective of the family, and to see Avery as a threat to the family, and to be protective of his brother. So I knew he was probably carrying a lot of guilt about the grief. And about what had happened, I knew, in addition to the guilt, so he kind of feels like he has to be perfect. So Grayson feels like he screwed up and someone died, so now he can never screw up again. And so that leads to the perfectionist. It also leads to like the locking down of emotions. So, and there's similarities between the two of them, because Jameson treats stuff as a game so it doesn't hurt, and Grayson keeps people far enough away that he can't get hurt. So they're kind of both on a mission not to get hurt again and not to feel again. And so I saw what I was doing by throwing Avery in there as a challenge to both of those things. Because of course, as these relationships develop, you're challenging both of their coping mechanisms for that grief.
That's so good. That's so smart. We have to round it up, wrap it up, whatever. Jen, you're amazing. It's so fun to get to talk.
Oh, it's been so fun chatting with you.
In emails. And the book is so good. It's obvious from the questions that most people here have read it already, but if you haven't, The Inheritance Games, if you're just tuning in, is an awesome, awesome page-turning read.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah,
and
pleasure.
Thank you, Barnes & Noble, YA Book Club, and YA Book Clubbers. This is your last reminder, but as Emily said, the book, as well as all the other books we've been talking about, are available from either bn.com or your local Barnes & Noble store. And if you haven't read the special second epilogue, I think it gives you a lot of insight, not into specifically where the next book is going, but into the mind of Tobias Hawthorne, which is kind of the driving force of these puzzles and all of these books. But it has been wonderful talking to you, and thank you so